Like she said, I'm Erin Melton, and I am from Westmoore High School, and my project is How Secular is Secularism.
So it was basically a comparison between not necessarily just the secularism in society in the United States and in France, but particularly how that affects religion's role in schools in the United States and in France. So in the United States, we have a constitutional separation of church and state. This exists in France as well. Here, that is what keeps our public schools out of like the scope and influence of any one religion. In France, though, it keeps religion outside of schools to an extent that would not be possible in the United States today. In March of 2004, the French Senate passed a bill prohibiting conspicuous religious symbols from being worn in public schools. However, this was more of a re-emphasis on the neutrality that's enforced in schools there than a change in policy. This is because the church-state separation was implemented by law in France in 1905. And it was implemented to protect the democracy of the state from the then dominant Catholic Church, while our church-state separation was aimed at protecting churches from the influence of the state. Due to this traditional secularity, religious neutrality in schools has been a cornerstone of the French Republic. Thus, when the education minister, if you could go to the next slide, he introduced the Charte de la Laïcité in September of 2013, which is this right here, which is actually a picture from a school. The rules didn't really change, but they were reinforced and further explained and just brought to the forefront so that students and teachers both could be more familiar with them. However, some religious minorities feel targeted by this crackdown on faith displays at school, particularly Islamic groups. The most noticeable dispute that has come about because of these rule changes, well, not changes, these rule enforcements, has been known as the headscarf controversy. And one of the students that I talked with in France told me that headscarves are seen relatively frequently worn in public, but never in school. And the more traditional Islamic groups have lashed out at the fact that girls won't be able to wear their traditional hijabs in school, and that's going completely against their faith, and it's not fair. But more unorthodox groups, more unorthodox Islamic groups have kind of praised the fact that maybe they don't want to wear these and that it could be, a freeing thing for them. And this sentiment of being targeted is exacerbated by the fact that many schools pretty much keep with Catholic traditions, like serving fish on Fridays, and all through Lent they serve fish. Like when we were there, they served fish every day. And while the government argues that this policy is aimed at better integration of different religious groups, critics argue that this kind of prevents integration because it seems to target certain groups. And I traveled to Chagny in France to kind of further understand how this affects schools and students and teachers and how they all feel about it. So I gave a survey to students in both schools here at Westmoore and in France. And I asked about their opinions on religion in life, in school, and in their relationships with other people. And it wasn't surprising to me that the students in Oklahoma, they responded in favor of religion in society and that it was a positive influence, while those in France claimed the opposite reply. And when I asked if religion is important in their daily lives, 62% of French students said no, while 49% of Westmoore students surveyed said yes. This difference became very apparent to me over the 2 weeks that I was in France. Despite the plethora of churches and cathedrals in the region, no one I came into contact with ever mentioned attending church. I never saw anyone going into churches other than to tour them, which is very different than here, because in Oklahoma you see pictures on Instagram and Facebook every Wednesday of people at youth group and all of their fun church activities. And if you go to the next slide. Students were presented with this statement: you prefer the idea of a very strict secularism. 62% of French students surveyed agreed, whereas 56% of the students surveyed at Westmoore disagreed. So it's clear that the rigidness of the church-state separation in France is appreciated by the young people, while the leniency in Oklahoma is appreciated by its people. If you could go to the next one. They were also presented with the statement, you think students should be able to express religious preferences at school. A decisive 67% of French students surveyed disagreed, while 56% of those surveyed at Westmoore agreed. So I took this as it could either be interpreted as students liking the reinforcement of secularism in France, or they just comply to it. It seemed to me, though, that they appreciate this, enforcement, because students that I spoke to on this subject, they conveyed to me that religion is a very, very personal and private thing, and it's just it's a thing that's very close to like one person's life, and it's not for other people to see in France, which is not really the same as the southern United States. Interestingly, though, if you go to the next slide, the majority of each group of students disagreed with the assertion that religion should affect how a government is run. So clearly young people in both nations agree with their idea of the separation of church and state. Both groups also disagreed with the assertion that religions of others affect their opinions of others. You could go to the next slide. Yeah, so we can see that the youth of both nations, find religion to be like a poor qualification for judgment, at least in general. So, and in France, that was clear because they weren't allowed to talk about it at school. No one really knew anyone's religious ideas, so they couldn't really pass judgment because of it. Again, the surveyed students were presented with a statement: restricting students' displays of their religions in schools is conducive to a respectful environment. 59% of French students agreed with this, while 43% of American counterparts disagreed. So I think this adds another layer to the approval that the youth of France seems to feel with regard to the enforced religious neutrality in schools. I think that it provides a buffer from like a whole type of bullying that could happen. And in the United States, I've never seen an all-out argument over religion, but there have been, heated discussions about religion in school, especially in history classes where religion is talked about. It's a very personal thing to people, but it's not a hidden personal thing. So people talk about it, and it happens, definitely. But in France, I never saw anything that could even come close to a religious argument at all in public. Even in private, with my second host sister, her family asked what my project was, and I told them. And she pointed to every person at the table and said, non-believer, non-believer, non-believer. But she is Christian, but it wasn't, like a sensitive subject for her. She wasn't saying it out of spite or anything. She was just informing me that that's what it was. Like, it was just completely normal. And if you could go to the next slide. Interestingly, as a general trend, the surveyed students of the French high school were pretty apathetic to the educational importance of religious awareness. Contrastingly, within those students of Westmoore, a majority felt that this awareness of different religions and beliefs is important to a thorough education for a young person. And evidently, the forced lack of religion in school leads to a lack of interest in religion in France, whereas the incorporated religious learning that comes with an education in the United States in most history classes leads to students' interest in it. And I spoke informally to students in my classes, and I discovered that most of them are very aware of this religious policy at their school, which isn't surprising because the charts are everywhere. And one student explained to me that if a girl shows up wearing, those little purity rings with a cross on it, her peers freak out, like it's weird. It's not a normal thing. And if you could go to the next slide. My second host sister's best friend had this cross tattooed on her wrist, and which means that she has to wear long sleeves every day because no one can see it. And she made this conscious decision to have to wear long sleeves every day of the school year to cover this cross tattoo, which in the United States, if you had a cross tattoo on your wrist, you'd show it off to your friends, like you'd wear short sleeves every day so that everyone would see it. It was frequently emphasized to me by all of the students and the one teacher that I spoke to about this, that religion is an extremely personal thing in France. The interviewed teacher provided that is the most important argument in favor of this policy in schools, telling me that people tend to stay away from the subject in public, just in conversation, so it just makes sense that it would be stayed away from in school as well. Next slide. So, although Oklahoma may not be the most accurate representation of the entire United States, The opinions of the students here can at least give an idea about the differences and similarities between religions placed in schools in the United States and in France. It is undeniable that the French government is more involved in keeping the institution of the church and the institution of education completely separate, and this is appreciated by its people. On the other hand, Oklahoman students appreciate the presence of religious discussion in school because they appreciate the presence of religion in daily life. The politics of this aspect of both school systems are rooted in their culture, because in France, religion is a sore subject because of the dominance of the Catholic Church in its history, and so it's been kept separate from politics, so it's been kept separate from education, while in the United States, we have a separation of church and state, but we're comparatively, we're a very religious society, so young people are brought up in that, and they love it, for the most part. So despite this cultural difference, though, most of the students could at least agree that religion shouldn't lead to judgment on other people, which I think is pretty great. Thank you.